William Dawson thought he was alone at the cemetery, until the woman kneeling in the frost looked up and said 7 words he would repeat in a federal courtroom 9 months later. She was 62 years old, 107 pounds, sleeping in a van. And pressed against her ribs inside a dead man's coat was a cracked phone holding 47 seconds of audio that could destroy the most protected man in Harlan Creek, Ohio. The battery was at 40%. It had been dropping for weeks. She had tried every door. Every one had closed. The only person left to tell was a Hell's Angel. And that turned out to be exactly enough. If those words landed somewhere in your chest, stay with me. Subscribe to Valiant Bikers and drop your city in the comments below. What happens next in this cemetery is only the beginning. She didn't die. They let her die. Those were the 7 words. Maggie said them standing in the frost at Harlan Creek Municipal Cemetery, Section D, Row 7, Plot 14, on a Tuesday morning in November. She said them without her voice breaking. She said them the way a nurse states a diagnosis. Flat, precise, stripped of everything except the clinical fact underneath. She had rehearsed this sentence in the van so many times it had worn a groove in her, the way water wears stone, and now it came out not as desperation, but as something harder. Testimony. Evidence. A woman who had run out of grief and arrived at something more durable. The grave she was tending belonged to a 34-year-old woman she had watched die on a hospital floor 17 months ago. She pressed the chrysanthemum into the frost-hardened soil with both hands. Her fingers curved slightly inward, the arthritis that had started 7 months ago when she could no longer afford the medication. She pressed anyway, using her palms, the way she'd learned to compensate. She'd been a nurse for 31 years. You adapt. You find another way. You keep your hands doing their work even when they hurt, because stopping means someone doesn't get what they need. She hadn't heard the boots behind her. The frost cracked softly under each footstep, a sound like thin glass giving way, and she stayed very still for a moment before she looked up. The man standing at the grave 1 row over was 6'1", 210 pounds. White beard kept neat against a square jaw. Thick white eyebrows over pale blue eyes. He wore a heavy flannel shirt under a leather vest that had clearly been through 20 winters. The patch on his back faced away from her, but she didn't need to read it. She'd heard the Hells Angels chapter rode out of the county on Route 9. She'd heard the town's feelings about them. In 31 years of ER nursing, she had treated men with those patches, bar fights, road rash, one memorable case involving a table saw, and in 31 years she had learned that the body in front of you tells you more than the label on its jacket. She made her clinical assessment in 3 seconds. Heart rate steady from his breathing. Posture open, not aggressive. Eyes on the grave, not on her. Not a threat. That judgment, in her current life, was not casual. It was the most important decision she made most days. He glanced over. He didn't say anything immediately, which she noticed. People who meant harm filled silence fast. This man let it sit. Then, quietly, "You come every Tuesday." It was not a question. He had noticed. He had simply waited until she was ready to be noticed. Maggie stood slowly. Her knees in the cold, she had learned, required patience. And she faced him at her full height. She didn't take a step back. She looked at him for a long moment. Thought about the medical board reviewer who had closed her complaint in 3 weeks. The attorney in Columbus who had called back to say he couldn't take the case. The sheriff who had turned her evidence report into a wellness check. The pastor who had told her bitterness was a poison. She thought about the phone in her pocket. 40% battery. Dropping. She didn't die. They let her die. The man did not look at the grave. He looked at her. Specifically at her hands, the professional's reflex when assessing someone in distress, curled slightly around nothing, wrapped in the sleeves of a navy peacoat 2 sizes too large. He took one deliberate step backward. Not away from her. Back. Creating distance the way a medic creates distance. Calm the space first, then the person. "Tell me from the beginning," he said. "I've got time." He pulled his collar up against the cold and settled his weight. The posture of a man who genuinely intended to stay. What he didn't know yet was what that phone in her pocket contained, what the notebook inside her coat held, what she had seen on the night of March 14th, 17 months ago, in the 3rd-floor corridor of Harlan Creek General Hospital. He didn't know any of it yet, but he had 8 words, and he'd said them right. And for a woman who had been running on empty for 17 months, 8 right words were everything. Maggie Ruth Calloway took one breath, and she started at the beginning. The beginning was a Thursday night in a hospital supply closet. She had gone back to the 3rd floor after her shift to retrieve her personal notebook from the medication cart. She always kept it there, a habit from her early years, dates and room numbers and observations she liked to carry with her. The supply closet door had jammed behind her. She'd been in there maybe 4 minutes, trying to work the handle, when she heard Dr. Gerald Foss's office door across the hall come partially open. His voice carried easily through the quiet. She had her phone in her coat pocket. She hit record on instinct. 31 years of emergency nursing. You document what you see. You document what you hear. You do it before you decide if it matters, because the moment you start deciding first, you start losing things that turn out to matter enormously. 47 seconds. His voice. One phone conversation, partially overheard. She filed a report. Night shift found it this morning. A pause. I'm not worried about the report. I'm worried about the nurse, because she's the only one in this building who actually knows what a potassium sequence looks like and why it would matter. Another pause. Handle the license. That's all I need. The rest takes care of itself. And then quieter, almost reflective. Dennis, we've done this before. The last one took 2 months. This is just a loose end. She had stood in that supply closet with her hand over her mouth and her heart hammering, and her mind doing what 31 years of ER training had built it to do. Assess, categorize, and do not panic until you are somewhere safe. She stayed until she heard his office door close. She walked out of the building without speaking to anyone. She drove home. She sat in her car in the driveway for 40 minutes. She wrote down every word she had heard, exactly as she had heard it, in her notebook, with the time and date at the top. She had been a nurse for 31 years. She knew what a potassium sequence administered at the wrong dosage would do to a cardiac patient's respiratory function. She had watched Gerald Foss give Claire Ann Whitfield a medication sequence that didn't match the chart. She had questioned it in the room. He had sent her out. Claire Whitfield was 34 years old. She had been admitted for an acute cardiac event, She was dead by 11:47 p.m. Maggie filed the incident report before she left the building. By Thursday, the report was gone. By Friday, her nursing license was under review. By the following month, her bank account was frozen in a civil dispute she still didn't fully understand. She tried to tell the Ohio State Medical Board. The reviewing officer, it turned out, had golfed with Gerald Foss the previous August. Her complaint was closed in 3 weeks as unsubstantiated. She tried to tell an attorney in Columbus. He took her initial meeting. He called back 4 days later. He couldn't take the case. She later learned that his firm's senior partner was Foss's brother-in-law. She tried to walk into the county sheriff's office with her notebook. The deputy took 20 minutes of notes. Then the sheriff came in, recognized her, and said, "Maggie, you've been through a lot. Have you spoken to anyone about how you're feeling?" Her evidence report was reclassified as a welfare check. No report filed. She tried to mail the notebook and a written statement to the Ohio Attorney General's office. No response. 6 months later, she learned the letter had been misrouted in their general complaint intake system and had never been reviewed by anyone. Her house foreclosed 9 months after she was fired. Her husband had died 2 years before all of this began. There was no one to call. She had been sleeping in the Dodge Caravan for 9 months. Preacher stood in the frost and listened to all of it without moving. He was the kind of man who had learned, in 7 years of army medicine in 2 different wars, that the most important thing you could do for someone describing a trauma was to hold very still and let them finish. Don't guide. Don't redirect. Don't try to make it more comfortable with questions. Just hold still and let them get to the end of it, because usually the end of it is the thing they've been carrying longest. When she was done, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "You said you have a recording." She reached into her coat and held the phone up. Screen cracked through the upper left corner. He could see, even from where he stood, the battery icon in the corner. 40%. She'd said it had been higher when she'd transferred the file from 2 previous phones. She didn't know how to do it again herself. "If that phone dies before someone gets the audio off it," she said, 17 months means nothing. What Preacher did not tell her, not yet, because she had already been failed by enough people who'd claimed they could help, was that there was a man in his chapter who had spent 9 years working in IT before he came back to the club. A man who could recover audio from a device with a failing battery in a matter of hours if he had the right equipment. A man who slept 4 hours a night and considered a technical problem a personal insult. What Preacher did instead was extend his hand. Open palm. Not a handshake, just an offering of steadiness. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then she placed her arthritic hand in his. He wrapped his fingers around hers gently, the way a medic holds an injury, supporting without compressing. And he said, "I spent 7 years watching men die because the wrong people were in charge of keeping them alive. That recording doesn't leave your possession until it's in front of the right eyes. And finding the right eyes, that's what we do." He meant every word. What neither of them knew yet was that the recording in her pocket was only the beginning of what they were going to find. The call went out 40 minutes later, from the parking lot of a gas station on Route 9 where Preacher had pulled over so he could hear clearly. "Deacon, it's Preacher." He heard the TV in the background go quiet on the other end. "Need every brother who can ride within 60 miles at the clubhouse. Today, before dark." A pause. The particular kind of pause that happened before a serious question. What's going on? There's a woman in this town who's been trying to tell the truth for 17 months, and every door that was supposed to be open to her has been slammed shut. She has evidence of a fatal encounter at Harlan Creek General, and the man who caused it is the most protected person in this county. We're not waiting for the system to decide when it's convenient. The line was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Say no more. We're coming. The call ended. No questions about proof or legal complications. No debate about jurisdiction. Just the sound of a man getting up from his chair. Because that's what Brotherhood meant. Not the absence of risk, but the decision that some things mattered more than the risk. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, 43 bikes had filled the lot outside the chapter clubhouse 14 miles east of Harlan Creek on Route 9. Now, if you know anything about this club from the outside, from the headlines, from the movie versions, from the way people in small towns lock their car doors when the formation rolls through, you might be imagining what 43 Hells Angels deciding to move on a situation look like. You might be picturing something loud and uncontrolled, something that would make the evening news for the wrong reasons. That's not what happened. That's not the story. What happened was quiet, disciplined. The kind of organized that comes from men who have spent years learning the difference between anger and action. Preacher sat Maggie down in the back room of the clubhouse, a folding table, 4 chairs, a space heater that knocked against the wall every few minutes, and introduced her, one by one, to the people who were going to help. Robert Haynes went by Doc. 63 years old. He had been an ER physician for 14 years before he spent 2 years fighting a hospital administration over a patient death, and came out the other side with no license and a paramedic certification he'd earned because staying out of medicine entirely wasn't something he knew how to do. He sat down across from Maggie, folded his hands on the table, and said, "Tell me the medication sequence you observed, exactly as you remember it." She told him. His jaw tightened once, almost imperceptibly. He nodded slowly. "I know what that does," he said. "I know exactly what that does." He didn't elaborate, because he didn't need to. They both spoke the same language. James Tully went by Cypher, 34 years old, the youngest full-patch member in the chapter by 6 years, IT background, going back to when he was 19. He looked at the cracked Samsung in Maggie's hand, turned it over once, checked the charge port, and said with the calm certainty of a man who considered a failing battery an insult to his competence. "Give me 4 hours and the right cable. We're not losing that file." Harold Murphy went by Deacon. 67. He had helped found this chapter 23 years ago. He had grown up in Harlan Creek proper, gone to high school 3 years ahead of Art Briggs, the county coroner. He sat down beside Preacher without saying much, turned the composition notebook over in his hands when Maggie passed it across the table, read the first entry dated March 14th, and the last entry dated the previous Tuesday. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something you recognize as important. He didn't need to be told who Art Briggs was. He'd known him since 1974. Kevin Strand went by Wire. 48 years old. He had spent 11 years as an investigative journalist before a story he'd spent 14 months reporting got spiked by the paper's ownership because one of the subjects was a major advertiser. He'd left the industry and patched in 3 years later. He still had contacts at the Columbus Dispatch. He still had a contact at the Ohio Attorney General's press office from a different story, a different decade, a different life. Some contacts you keep because you never know. Carl Bassett went by Stone. 59. 22 years as a Harlan County deputy sheriff before he left the department on principle following a situation he described when asked, only as a decision I couldn't live with if I stayed. He sat across from Maggie for 10 minutes, asked 4 precise questions about the sheriff's handling of her evidence report, and wrote 3 words in his own notebook. He did not share them immediately. He would share them when the time was right. Maggie sat at that folding table in the back room of a Hells Angels clubhouse on a cold Tuesday afternoon and answered every question they asked her. She had her notebook. She had her phone. Plugged in now, Cypher's cable running to a power bank, the extraction process already running in the background. She had 17 months of documented dates, room numbers, medication sequences, and observations. She had the names of 4 people who had seen things and said nothing. What she didn't know yet was that the woman she had watched die in room 314 on the night of March 14th was not the first. That was coming. But not yet. For now, it was enough that 43 men had ridden out on a cold November afternoon, and not one of them had asked her to prove she was worth believing first. For the first time in 17 months, Margaret Ruth Calloway put her composition notebook on a table in front of other people and did not have to convince them she was sane. "Preacher," Doc said quietly when Maggie stepped away to use the restroom and the door clicked shut. "If what she's describing is accurate, the dosage sequence, the timing, the policy activation, this isn't one incident." Preacher looked at him. "This is a pattern," Doc said. "And patterns don't start with the one you catch." The room was quiet for a moment. The space heater knocked against the wall. What Doc said next, what he suspected, what his 14 years in emergency medicine had made him suspect the moment Maggie described what she'd seen, would not be confirmed for another 4 days. But it would be confirmed. By Wednesday morning, Cypher had the audio file on 3 separate devices, 2 encrypted cloud backups, and a USB drive that Preacher put in the inside pocket of his own vest and did not remove. 47 seconds. Foss's voice, clear enough. The specific words. Dennis. 2 months. A loose end. The phone had gone dark at 11% battery at 2:17 a.m. while Cypher was still working, and Cypher had looked at the blank screen for exactly 4 seconds before retrieving the file from the first backup and verifying the waveform intact. He had not slept. He did not appear to require it. Maggie had sat in the clubhouse overnight in a folding chair with a blanket someone had brought from a back room, and in the morning, one of the prospects had made coffee. Actual coffee, not gas station coffee, and put it in front of her without a word, and she had held the cup in both arthritic hands and felt the warmth move through her palms and thought, with a clarity that surprised her. This is the first time in 17 months I have not been afraid to fall asleep. But the audio file, necessary as it was not going to be sufficient on its own. Stone had been clear about that the night before, in the precise and unsentimental way of a man who had spent 22 years watching good cases fall apart in courtrooms because the foundation under them wasn't wide enough. "1 recording, 1 witness," he'd said. "That's a story. We need it to be a case." Wire had reached his contact at the Columbus Dispatch at 7 in the morning. Not to publish, not yet. To listen. To begin the process of understanding what kind of institutional support they were dealing with and where the pressure points were. His contact had a name for this kind of arrangement, had seen versions of it before in larger cities, and the name was not encouraging. What it meant, practically, was that there were people in this county whose professional survival depended on Gerald Foss remaining above scrutiny. which meant every door Maggie had knocked on for 17 months had not simply been closed by indifference. Some of them had been closed deliberately. Deacon drove into Harlan Creek alone, in his truck without his vest. He had grown up here. His truck had a Harlan Creek High School sticker from 1974 still half peeled on the rear window. He parked in front of the hardware store on Main Street and went inside and stood at the counter and waited for Art Briggs to finish with a customer. And when Briggs looked up and saw him, something crossed the coroner's face that was not quite recognition and not quite fear, but contained elements of both. "Harold," Briggs said. "Art," Deacon said, "I need you to look at something." He placed a single sheet of paper on the counter, printed from Maggie's notebook. Dates, room numbers, cause of death notations, insurance policy timelines, 4 names over 9 years. He watched Art Briggs read it. He watched Art Briggs's hands go very still. "I'm not here for a fight," Deacon said quietly. "I'm here because we went to school together. And because you have a chance right now, today, to be on the right side of this before it's not a choice anymore." What Deacon did not tell Briggs, because it was not yet the moment to tell him, was that Stone had already filed a formal complaint with the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Not the county sheriff, who had reclassified Maggie's report as a wellness check, specifically outlining the procedural irregularities in the handling of her original evidence report. The Highway Patrol had jurisdiction. The county sheriff did not have the authority to intercept it, and what Deacon did not know yet, sitting across a hardware store counter from a man he'd known since 1974, was that Briggs had been waiting for this. Not wanting it, but waiting for it, the way a man waits for the thing he knows is coming because he made the wrong choice long enough ago that he'd stopped being able to see the exit. Dorothy Hargrove had lived across the street from Claire Whitfield for 11 years. She was 71 years old, a retired school teacher, and she had a habit of being outside by 7 a.m. regardless of weather because she had grown up on a farm, and the habit never left. She had seen Claire Whitfield at her mailbox on the morning of March 12th, 2 days before Claire was admitted to Harlan Creek General. She told Wire this sitting at her own kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, voice steady with the particular steadiness of someone who had been rehearsing this testimony in their own mind for a long time. "She was perfectly fine," Dorothy said. "She was laughing at something on her phone. She waved at me. She looked like herself." Wire wrote it down. "Did you say anything after she died?" Dorothy's hands tightened around the mug. "I said something to my neighbor. Jean. I said it seemed awfully sudden. Jean said, 'Well, you never know with the heart, do you?' And I said, 'I suppose not.'" She paused. "I wish I'd said more. I've wished that for 17 months. She had seen the ambulance on the night of the 14th. She had seen the lights, but no urgency. The particular absence of rushing that means the outcome has already been decided. She had noted it. She had not known what to do with what she'd noted. She was the kind of witness Stone and Wire needed. Specific, credible, without agenda. A 71-year-old retired school teacher who waved at her neighbor 2 days before the neighbor was declared dead of a cardiac event. A woman who had noticed the absence of emergency in an emergency response. She gave them a written statement before they left. Sandra Kowalski had been an ICU nurse at Harlan Creek General for 6 years before she left the county entirely and moved to Columbus. She was 54 now. She had been waiting, in her own words, for someone to ask me the right questions for 7 years. She drove to the clubhouse that afternoon in a gray Honda Civic, shook Preacher's hand with the firm grip of someone who had made up her mind before she got in the car, and sat down across from Doc. They spoke the same language immediately. She didn't need to be prompted. In her time in the ICU, she had observed 2 patient deaths that she had considered clinically atypical for the presenting condition. Both patients had been admitted through the ER. Both had been under Dr. Foss's primary care. Both had deteriorated at a rate inconsistent with their initial assessment. She had raised her concerns informally to the unit supervisor after the second death. 2 months later, she had been transferred to a county facility 40 miles away. She had left Ohio entirely 4 months after that. "I want you to understand something," she said to Doc, leaning forward slightly. "I knew something was wrong. I documented what I observed in my own personal notes, not the official record, because I'd already seen what happened to the official record. But I didn't push further. I told myself it was enough that I'd said something. I told myself the transfer was a coincidence." She paused. "It wasn't a coincidence. And I think about those patients every single week." She had brought her personal notes. 7 years old, handwritten, dated. 2 names, 2 dates. 2 clinical observations that, placed beside Maggie's notebook, beside the audio file, beside the insurance policy timelines that Wire was already pulling from public records in Columbus, began to form something that was no longer a story, something that was a pattern with receipts. This is what institutions count on, and it almost always works, that the people who see things work in isolation. That the nurse in the ICU doesn't know about the nurse on the 3rd floor. That the neighbor with her morning observation doesn't know about the retired teacher 2 streets over. That the evidence stays scattered, separate, deniable. That the people carrying it individually are too tired, too alone, too discredited, too afraid to find each other. The pattern that Gerald Foss had been operating inside for 9 years depended on this. It depended on the pieces never meeting in the same room. They were now in the same room. Earl Preston had been Thomas Harold Graves's teaching colleague for 19 years. Thomas Graves, 67, retired, no surviving family. Admitted to Harlan Creek General in March of 2018. Dead 9 days later. Official cause: respiratory failure following pneumonia. Insurance payout: $329,000. Time between policy activation and death: 11 weeks. Earl Preston was 68 years old, and he had been carrying what he knew about Thomas Graves the way a man carries something too heavy to put down and too important to drop. He came to his 40th class reunion 6 weeks before he died, Earl told Stone, sitting in the front seat of Stone's truck, because Earl had not wanted to meet anywhere he might be recognized. He was fine. He was better than fine. He was planning a fishing trip to Montana. He showed me pictures of the cabin he'd rented. Stone wrote carefully. When I heard he'd died, I didn't believe it at first. I called the hospital. They said it had been a rapid progression. I asked to speak to the attending physician. Earl paused. Dr. Foss called me back personally. Very warm. Very sorry for my loss. Said Thomas had been sicker than he appeared, that these things happened with pneumonia in older patients, that the family, there was no family, that was the thing. There was no one to push back. He stopped. I should have pushed back. I've told myself 1,000 times I should have pushed back. when Stone showed him the insurance document. The policy on Thomas Harold Graves, $329,000, beneficiary listed as a charitable foundation that Wire had spent 40 minutes tracing back to a shell entity connected to a Foss LLC, registered in 2016. Earl Preston sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" Doc was the one who found the second policy. He was working through the public records Wire had pulled, cross-referencing dates against Maggie's notebook when he found it, not in a dramatic moment, not with any announcement. He simply went quiet for several seconds, then called Preacher over with a single word. The previous death was not a patient. It was Gerald Foss's first wife. Barbara Ellen Foss, 51 years old, died in October 2016 of what her death certificate listed as complications following a respiratory infection. The certificate had been signed by Arthur Briggs. The life insurance policy on Barbara Ellen Foss, $412,000, activated 14 weeks before her death. The beneficiary, Gerald Allen Foss. Doc set the document down on the table with the particular steadiness of a man who is very angry and very controlled about it. "He's been doing this for 9 years, he said, at minimum. 11 entries in the encrypted folder. 9 years. 1 wife. Multiple patients. A coroner who signed every death certificate without requesting a single autopsy. A medical board reviewer who golfed with the subject of the complaint. An attorney whose firm had a senior partner in the family. A sheriff who turned an evidence report into a wellness check. A pastor who told a woman that bitterness was a poison. This town was not simply a place where a doctor had done something wrong. It was a place where the entire architecture of accountability had been quietly, gradually, over years, not broken, but repurposed. Rebuilt to protect the people at its center. And every institution that Maggie Calloway had trusted with the truth had performed exactly as it had been rebuilt to perform. The system hadn't failed. It had functioned. For the wrong people. Stone made the call to the Ohio State Highway Patrol at 4:17 in the afternoon. His contact, a lieutenant he had worked alongside in a different county 8 years ago, a woman named Hargrove, who had no relation to Dorothy and who took organized crime referrals seriously, listened for 11 minutes without interrupting. He walked her through the audio file, the insurance documents, the witness statements, the previous victim, the shell entity, the coroner's signatures. She asked 2 questions, both precise. She said, "Give me until morning." The morning came gray and cold, the kind of November morning in rural Ohio that settles into the bones and stays. By 7 a.m., 43 bikes from the Harlan Creek chapter had been joined by 67 from Zanesville and 57 from Chillicothe, the Chillicothe chapter having ridden 89 miles in overnight temperatures that had dropped to 22 degrees. 167 motorcycles. The last time all 3 chapters had mobilized together was a veteran's funeral in 2019. They did not go to the hospital. They did not go to Gerald Foss's house. They parked in the municipal lot on the south end of Harlan Creek's main street, in rows as orderly as anything the town had ever produced, engines cutting off almost in unison, so that the silence that followed felt sudden and enormous, like a held breath. 167 men in leather vests standing beside their bikes, not moving, not shouting, not making a single threatening gesture. Simply present. Now, if you've spent your life absorbing what popular culture says about this club, your first thought looking at that parking lot might be, here it comes. The chaos, the confrontation, the thing that ends with property damage and someone on the evening news. That's not the story. That is specifically not the story. What 167 men parked in a municipal lot did was provide an unignorable public fact. That this many people had decided this mattered enough to ride through the night in 22-degree weather. That is not a mob. That is a declaration. And declarations, it turns out, have a way of loosening things that have been held in place by the assumption that no one is watching. 3 people called the county newspaper within the first hour. 2 people who worked at Harlan Creek General called their union representatives. 1 person, a billing employee who had been quietly documenting patterns in insurance-flagged admissions for 3 years in personal emails that she had never sent to anyone, forwarded those emails to Wire's contact at the Columbus Dispatch at 9:14 in the morning. Ohio State Highway Patrol, Lieutenant Karen Hargrove, arrived at Gerald Foss's residence on Lakeview Drive at 10:53 a.m. with 2 investigators and a warrant. He was in his kitchen, wearing reading glasses, a fleece vest, flannel pants, making coffee. There was a half-eaten piece of toast on the counter beside the coffee maker. He looked up when they came through the door, the kind of confused, mildly irritated expression of a man interrupted before his morning had properly started. The same hands that had administered a medication sequence to a 34-year-old woman on the night of March 14th were wrapped around a coffee mug when they read him his rights. The same gold wire-rimmed glasses he wore at the Harvest Festival fundraiser were pushed up his nose when they told him the charges. Felony homicide, 1st degree, 2 counts. Insurance fraud, criminal, multiple counts, conspiracy to commit fraud, tampering with official records, obstruction of a public health investigation. He said nothing. He set the coffee mug down very carefully, the way a man sets something down when he is buying himself a second to think. And then he said, in his warm baritone, "I want my attorney." They walked him out through his own front door in handcuffs, in his reading glasses, and his fleece vest, past the Gerald A. Foss Science Center plaque on the wall of his entryway, past the framed Citizen of the Year certificate from 2021. Dennis Wayne Hale was arrested at his Columbus office at 11:17 a.m. Arthur Briggs walked into the Highway Patrol's Harlan Creek satellite office at noon and asked to speak to someone. He had been in that hardware store behind that counter since 6 a.m., and when Deacon's truck had driven past at 8:30, and Deacon had not looked in the window, Briggs had known. He surrendered his coroner's credentials on the counter. He asked for a lawyer and a deal. In that order. The last time all 3 chapters had mobilized together was a veteran's funeral. This time was different. In the municipal parking lot, 167 engines stayed silent. Nobody cheered. Nobody shouted. Preacher stood at the front of the formation with his hands in his vest pockets and watched the highway patrol vehicles pull onto Lakeview Drive, and he thought about his sister, about the hospital that had told his family she was anxious, about the 2 years he'd spent asking questions that went nowhere, about the particular exhaustion of being right and having no one believe you. Behind him, in a folding chair that one of the prospects had carried from the clubhouse, and set up in the parking lot because they had noticed that she had been standing for 3 hours and she was 107 pounds and it was 28 degrees. Margaret Ruth Calloway sat with her composition notebook open in her lap. She was writing the last entry. The date at the top. Then one sentence, the same sentence she had written every Tuesday for 17 months. I was there. I know what I saw. Then, below it, for the first time, a second sentence. Today, someone else knows it too. The first concrete thing that changed was the van. Not because it was the most important thing, it wasn't, but because Stone understood, with the practicality of a man who had spent 22 years in law enforcement, watching situations deteriorate for want of basic logistics, that everything else depended on it. You cannot process trauma. You cannot heal. You cannot begin to reconstruct a life from a folding chair in a municipal parking lot. You need 4 walls and a door that locks from the inside, and a temperature that does not drop to 19 degrees at 3 in the morning. He made 2 calls before noon. The first was to a woman named Ruth Alderman, 64, who owned a rental property on the east side of Harlan Creek, a small white house with a covered porch, 2 bedrooms, a working furnace, that had been sitting empty for 4 months. Stone had helped Ruth's son with a situation 7 years ago that Ruth had never forgotten and never mentioned to anyone and considered a debt still outstanding. He explained the circumstances. Ruth listened without interrupting. She said, "First month free. After that, we'll talk." The second call was to the Ohio Nurses Association, whose legal advocacy arm had a whistleblower restitution fund that Stone had known about from a case he'd worked adjacent to in 2018. The fund existed specifically for licensed nurses who had suffered professional retaliation for reporting patient safety concerns. Maggie's case, documented, time-stamped, with audio evidence and multiple corroborating witnesses, was, as the intake attorney told Stone when he outlined it, exactly what this fund was designed for. The initial emergency disbursement was processed within 48 hours, $11,000 to cover immediate living expenses, medical costs, and legal representation, while her formal application was reviewed. Wire's contact at the Columbus Dispatch ran the story on Friday. Above the Fold, digital edition. It was picked up by the Associated Press by Saturday afternoon. Doc drove Maggie to a medical clinic in Zanesville on Thursday morning, not Harlan Creek General, which was currently under a joint investigation by the Ohio Department of Health and the State Medical Board, and which would not have been Maggie's first choice in any case. The attending physician, a woman named Dr. Carol Whitman, who read Doc's brief summary on the drive over and was already on the phone with a specialist before Maggie sat down, confirmed the arthritis diagnosis, prescribed a course of anti-inflammatory medication, and referred her to a rheumatologist in Columbus for a full assessment. She also noted, with clinical directness and a look at Maggie that contained a particular kind of recognition, one medical professional acknowledging what another had endured, that Maggie's weight and the evidence of prolonged cold exposure and sleep deprivation qualified her for a full nutritional and cardiovascular workup, which they scheduled for the following week. Maggie sat in the examining room in a paper gown and did not cry. She had not cried yet. Not since the cemetery. Doc waited in the hallway and did not comment on how long she took to come back out, because he understood from 14 years of practicing emergency medicine that sometimes the body needs a moment to absorb the fact that someone is finally paying attention to it. She came out with her prescription and her referral paperwork and the card of a therapist in Zanesville who specialized in occupational trauma, which Dr. Whitman had included without being asked. "You didn't have to add that," Maggie said. "Yes, I did," Dr. Whitman said simply. "Call her. She's good." The White House on the East Side had 3 things Maggie noted when Stone walked her through it on Thursday afternoon. A working furnace, a kitchen with a full-size refrigerator, and a window in the front room that faced east, so the morning light came through it at an angle that would reach the small table by the wall. The table where Cypher had already set up a basic laptop, second-hand but functional, that the chapter had collectively purchased for approximately $400 and which Deacon had quietly ensured was connected to working internet before they arrived. She stood in the front room for a moment with her hands at her sides and her navy peacoat still on, and looked at the morning light coming through the east window. She had not stood in a room that was hers, not a supply closet, not a van, not a folding chair in a back room, for 9 months. She touched the ID badge in her coat pocket. Old habit. The reflex of a woman who had used that gesture to steady herself through 17 months of being told she didn't know what she'd seen. Then she took her hand out of her pocket, walked to the table, and sat down. The Ohio State Medical Board convened an emergency review panel within 10 days of the Highway Patrol's arrest. The review was not conducted by a panel member with ties to Gerald Foss. This was not an accident. Wire had ensured, through his contact at the dispatch and a carefully placed call to the AG's office, that the panel composition was publicly visible before it was finalized. When one originally assigned member's social connection to Foss was surfaced in the dispatch's follow-up coverage, he recused himself before he was asked. The formal hearing ran 3 days. Evidence presented included the 47-second audio file, authenticated and transcribed. Maggie's composition notebook entered as Exhibit A every entry from the night of March 14th through the last Tuesday in November, including the final entry with its second sentence written in a parking lot, while 167 engines sat silent. Sandra Kowalski's personal nursing notes from 2017, corroborating atypical patient decline under Foss's care. Earl Preston's written statement about Thomas Harold Graves. Dorothy Hargrove's testimony regarding Claire Whitfield's condition 2 days before admission. The insurance documents, the shell entity, the wire transfers, the 11 encrypted entries spanning 9 years, the policy on Barbara Ellen Foss, the billing employee's 3 years of documented pattern observations submitted through counsel under formal whistleblower protection. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Gerald Allen Foss was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree felony homicide, 6 counts of criminal insurance fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. He was sentenced to 23 years in state prison with no parole eligibility for 14. Dennis Wayne Hale received 18 years. No parole for 10. Arthur Briggs, in exchange for his cooperation and his testimony, which proved essential to establishing the coroner's role in the pattern of falsified death certificates, received a suspended sentence, mandatory surrender of his elected position, and permanent prohibition from holding any public office or working in any official capacity. He would spend the rest of his life in Harlan Creek, owning his hardware store, waving from his truck, carrying what he knew about what he'd signed his name to. Some consequences are not punitive. Some are simply the permanent weight of a choice that can't be unmade. Maggie's nursing license was reinstated by the Ohio State Medical Board in a unanimous vote, the formal letter arriving on a Tuesday morning in February, which she later said she considered a coincidence, and then decided she didn't. 6 months after a November Tuesday in a frost-covered cemetery, the Hells Angels Ohio chapter held what Deacon described, with characteristic understatement, as a small gathering at the clubhouse on Route 9. It was not small. Approximately 90 people filled the main room and spilled out into the lot, which was strung with lights someone had found in a storage room, and which Cypher had spent an afternoon hanging with a level of geometric precision that the other brothers had not expected from a man who spent most of his time staring at screens. There was food. Actual food, not paper plates and chips, but a full spread that had been organized by 3 of the chapter members' wives and partners who had heard the story and decided that a woman who had survived 17 months on gas station coffee and stubbornness deserved something that tasted like it had been made by people who cared. Maggie arrived in her own car, a 2019 Subaru Outback, used, purchased with the first payment from the restitution fund, which had ultimately disbursed $43,000 over the course of the review process. She was wearing a blue sweater. Her hair was still white. It had gone white in the first months after she was fired, and it had stayed white. And she had stopped thinking about it as a marker of what had been taken from her, and started thinking about it as simply what her hair was now. She was 122 pounds. Her arthritis was managed. She was sleeping 7 hours a night in the White House on the east side with the east-facing window. She had attended 6 sessions with the therapist in Zanesville. She had another 6 scheduled. She had been offered a position as a clinical advisor to the Ohio Nurses Association's whistleblower advocacy program, part documentation review, part testimony support for nurses navigating formal complaint processes, and had accepted it and had worked her first case from her laptop at the table by the east window in the pale morning light the previous week. Preacher met her at the door. White beard, pale blue eyes, the faded patch on the back of his vest from 23 years of riding. He shook her hand with both of his, the way he had in the cemetery, supporting, not compressing, and said, "You look different." She considered this. "I'm warm," she said. He nodded. "That'll do it." The Ohio Department of Health implemented new protocols for death certificate review in rural single-hospital counties within 8 months of the Foss conviction. The protocols required independent autopsy consultation for any patient death occurring within 30 days of a large insurance policy activation. Mandatory, not recommended. Mandatory. The Ohio State Medical Board restructured its complaint review process to prohibit assignment of cases to reviewers with any documented professional or social connection to the subject of the complaint. The restructuring was proposed by a junior board member who had read the dispatch's coverage and spent a weekend writing the policy language. 6 other states contacted the Ohio AG's office for copies of the investigative framework within the first year. And in Harlan Creek, at Harlan Creek General, which was now under new clinical leadership, following the resignations of 3 board members connected to Foss's tenure, a small placard was mounted in the 3rd-floor corridor near the supply closet where a charge nurse had once stood in the dark with her hand over her mouth and her phone recording. It read, "In memory of Claire Ann Whitfield and Thomas Harold Graves, and in recognition of the people who refused to stop telling the truth. No names, just the fact of it. The acknowledgement that someone had stood in this hallway and seen something and said so, and that the saying so had mattered, even when it took 17 months and a cracked phone and a cemetery in the first frost of November, and one man willing to stand still and listen. This story is not really about a motorcycle club. It's not about leather vests or road names or the sound of 167 engines going quiet in a municipal parking lot on a cold Ohio morning, as extraordinary as that moment was. It's about what happens when a woman who did everything right, documented, reported, followed every procedure, knocked on every door, is systematically turned away by every institution that should have protected her. And what happens when one person, just one, decides to stand still and listen instead? Because here is what Maggie Calloway's story actually teaches, if you're willing to look at it directly. The system that failed her was not broken. A broken system fails by accident, through incompetence, through overwhelm, through the gaps that exist in every structure. What Maggie encountered was not broken. It was functional. It was working as it had been quietly, gradually rebuilt to work, to root complaints away from resolution, to reclassify inconvenient evidence, to protect the people at its center by discrediting the people at its edges. The medical board reviewer who golfed with Foss was not a coincidence. The attorney whose firm partnered with Foss's brother-in-law was not a coincidence. The sheriff who turned a formal evidence report into a wellness check was not a coincidence. These were the architecture of a system that had been built, piece by piece, to be impenetrable. And it was impenetrable for 17 months to a woman with 31 years of professional credibility, a recorded confession, and a documented notebook. What it was not impenetrable to was 167 people deciding simultaneously that this was not acceptable. This is the part that matters. This is the part worth sitting with. You do not need a motorcycle club to be someone who stands still and listens. You do not need a chapter behind you, or a contact at the Attorney General's office, or a brother who can recover audio from a dying phone at 2 in the morning. What you need, what Maggie needed, what every person who has ever been right about something terrible and been told they were wrong has needed, is for the person in front of them to hold still, look them in the eye, and say, "Tell me from the beginning." I've got time, that's it. That's the whole intervention, at its most fundamental level, someone willing to use 8 words correctly. If you work in healthcare, if you're a nurse, a technician, an aide, an administrator who has ever looked at something in a corridor or on a chart or in a medication sequence and felt the particular dissonance of a professional who knows something is wrong, know this: what you see is admissible. What you document matters. The Ohio Nurse Practice Act has formal retaliation protections. Every state has equivalents. They are imperfect. They require advocacy to activate. But they exist. And they have teeth when someone who knows how to use them decides to use them. Write the date. Write the time. Write what you saw, what you heard, who was present. Write it the night it happens, before you sleep, before you decide whether it's worth writing. Write it the way Maggie wrote it. Because 31 years of emergency nursing had built in her the reflex of documentation before deliberation. Write it because the moment you start deciding whether something is worth recording before you record it, you start losing things that turn out to matter enormously. And if you are not in healthcare, if you are a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, a person who lives across the street, or sits 2 pews over, or works in the next office, the lesson is simpler and harder at the same time. Believe people, not blindly, not without discernment. But when someone tells you something happened to them, something institutional, something covered, something they've been trying to report for months or years, resist the first reflex, which is to find the reason it probably didn't happen the way they say. Resist the instinct to locate the explanation that requires less from you. Because the explanation that requires less from you is almost always the one that leaves someone else alone with something they cannot carry. There are Maggie Callaways everywhere. Not necessarily in vans behind Dollar Generals, not necessarily with cracked phones and 40% batteries, though sometimes exactly that. They are people who saw something real and reported it correctly and were told, in 100 different institutional languages, that what they saw was not what they saw. They are still carrying it. Some of them have been carrying it for 17 months. Some for longer. You don't have to mobilize 167 people to change that. You just have to hold still and listen until they get to the end. On a Tuesday morning in May, 6 months after the first frost, 6 months after a cemetery, 6 months after 8 words said correctly in the cold, Maggie Calloway parked her Subaru on Old Mill Road and walked through the iron gate of Harlan Creek Municipal Cemetery. Section D, Row 7, Plot 14. The frost was gone. The grass was green and soft and giving under her feet. She could hear, from somewhere 2 farms over, not a rooster this time, but a lawnmower, and birds, and the distant sound of a screen door, the ordinary percussion of a town in late spring. She carried a single yellow chrysanthemum, 2-handed, close to her chest, the way you carry something that matters. She knelt at the grave without difficulty. Her knees these days, in the warmth, allowed it, and pressed the flower into the soil. She did not need to use her palms anymore. Her hands had steadied. The medication had done what it was supposed to do, quietly and consistently, the way good medicine does. She stayed for a few minutes. Then she stood, and she walked back through the iron gate, and she got into her car, and she drove to work. The notebook was at home on the table by the east window. She had not needed to carry it against her ribs for warmth and protection in a long time. But she had kept it. She would always keep it. Because the first entry was dated March 14th. And the last entry, not the one written in a parking lot in November, but the one she had added the day the conviction was handed down, the day the jury came back in under 3 hours, read simply, Claire, Thomas. I was there, I knew what I saw, and in the end, it was enough. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to Valiant Bikers so you don't miss the next one. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth has a way of finding its people, even when every door has been closed. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about someone who believed you when nobody else would. Or tell me about a time you chose to hold still and listen, because those moments, the small ones, the quiet ones, the 8-word ones, are where every story like this one actually begins.